In a time of uncertainty, two superpowers clashed, not with weapons, but with their very beliefs. The Cold War was not just a battle for dominance, it was a fight for the future of the world. For over 4 decades, the world stood on the brink of annihilation. Two superpowers, locked in an ideological struggle, shaped global history in ways still felt today. The Cold War wasn't just a military standoff. It was a battle of ideologies, technology, espionage, and proxy wars. This is the story of the Cold War. Today, we dive deep into this pivotal conflict, exploring the politics, espionage, and moments that almost led us to the brink of global disaster. Let's rewind the clock and uncover the secrets of a time when the world was divided like never before. Roots of the Cold War. The origins of the Cold War can be traced to the final years of World War II. The United States and the Soviet Union, once allies against Nazi Germany, quickly found themselves at odds. The ideological divide between democracy and communism became clear at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences in 1945. As Europe lay in ruins, the question arose, who would shape its future? Allies turned rivals. The US and the Soviet Union had cooperated to defeat Nazi Germany, but their alliance was fragile. They had fundamentally different political and economic systems, capitalism and democracy in the US versus communism and state control in the USSR Yalta and Potsdam conferences. These meetings in 1945 were crucial in determining the post-war world order. The agreements made, and disagreements that surfaced, planted the seeds of future conflicts. While both nations aimed to shape Europe's future, they had vastly different visions. The ideological divide. The statement mentions democracy and communism as two opposing ideologies. The US feared Soviet expansion and totalitarianism, while the USSR saw Western policies as a threat to its security. Europe in ruins. The devastation of World War II left many countries vulnerable. This allowed both superpowers to exert influence, with the USSR controlling Eastern Europe and the US investing in Western European recovery. This rivalry over shaping Europe's future set the stage for the Cold War. The early Cold War, 1947 to 1953. The policy of containment. After World War II, the Soviet Union expanded its influence across Eastern Europe, installing communist governments in countries like Poland, East Germany, and Hungary. The US feared that unchecked Soviet expansion would lead to the spread of communism across the world. To counter this, the US adopted the policy of containment, a strategic approach aimed at preventing further Soviet influence rather than rolling it back. The Truman Doctrine, 1947. President Harry S. Truman introduced this doctrine in 1947, stating that the US would provide political, military, and economic assistance to countries threatened by communism. This was first applied to Greece and Turkey, both of which were at risk of falling under Soviet influence. The doctrine set a precedent for future US interventions around the world, reinforcing the idea that America had a duty to defend democracy. The Marshall Plan, 1948. Officially called the European Recovery Program, the Marshall Plan was an ambitious effort to rebuild war-torn Europe. The US provided over $13 billion, equivalent to hundreds of billions today, in economic aid to Western European nations. The main goals were restoring European economies to prevent economic instability, which could lead to communist revolutions, strengthening political stability to counteract Soviet pressure, rebuilding industries and infrastructure to create strong trade allies for the US. The Soviet Union rejected the aid and prevented Eastern European countries from participating, reinforcing the division between East and West. Formation of NATO, 1949. In response to growing Soviet aggression, the US and Western European nations formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1949. It was a military alliance aimed at collective defense. If one NATO member was attacked, all would respond. NATO was a direct countermeasure against the Soviet-controlled Warsaw Pact, which was established in 1955. This alliance strengthened US military presence in Europe and ensured long-term cooperation among Western democracies. Significance of these actions. The combination of containment, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and NATO established the U.S. as the leader of the Western Bloc. These efforts heightened Cold War tensions, as the Soviet Union viewed them as direct threats to its ideology and security. It laid the foundation for decades of geopolitical rivalry, influencing conflicts like the Berlin Blockade, Korean War, and Cuban Missile Crisis. The nuclear arms race and space race, 1953 to 1970. The nuclear era began with the U.S. dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. This showed the world, and particularly the Soviet Union, the devastating power of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union, feeling vulnerable and determined to match U.S. power, accelerated its own nuclear program. By 1949, the Soviets successfully tested their first atomic bomb, ending the U.S. monopoly on nuclear weapons and beginning an intense arms race. Development of more lethal weapons, 1950s. Both superpowers soon developed the hydrogen bomb H-bomb, which was far more powerful than the atomic bomb. The U.S. first tested an H-bomb in 1952, followed by the Soviet Union in 1953. The arms race quickly escalated, with each side building increasingly powerful nuclear weapons. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and the threat of global destruction. In the late 1950s, both nations developed ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, which could deliver nuclear warheads across vast distances in minutes. This meant that for the first time, both the US and the USSR were vulnerable to instant nuclear attack, increasing global anxiety. The concept of mutually assured destruction, MAD, emerged. If one side launched an attack, the other would respond with equal force, leading to total annihilation. The end of the arms race, 1980s to 1991. By the 1980s, the arms race was becoming financially unsustainable, especially for the Soviet Union, whose economy was struggling. U.S. President Ronald Reagan introduced the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, nicknamed Star Wars, a plan to develop a space-based missile defense system. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, sought to reduce tensions and negotiated with the U.S. in the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, in 1987, which eliminated certain types of nuclear weapons. As the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Cold War ended, and the arms race slowed down. Beyond Earth's atmosphere, another battle raged, the space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. The U.S. responded with its own space programs, culminating in the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969. This was more than scientific achievement. It was a Cold War victory. Proxy wars and crisis points, 1960s to 1980s. While the United States and the Soviet Union never engaged in direct military conflict, they fought through proxy wars, supporting opposing sides in conflicts across the globe. These wars were battlegrounds where communist and capitalist ideologies clashed, shaping the geopolitics of entire regions. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. The world on the brink. One of the closest moments to nuclear war during the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, where U.S.-backed Cuban exiles attempted to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government, tensions escalated. The Soviet Union, under Nikita Khrushchev, secretly deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. In response, U.S. President John F. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade around Cuba, demanding the removal of the missiles. For 13 days, the world held its breath, fearing a catastrophic nuclear war. A tense negotiation followed, resulting in the Soviets removing their missiles from Cuba in exchange for the U.S. secretly withdrawing missiles from Turkey and pledging not to invade Cuba. This event highlighted the dangers of nuclear brinkmanship and led to the establishment of the Moscow-Washington Hotline, a direct communication link between the superpowers, the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. America's costly war. The Vietnam War was one of the most significant and devastating conflicts of the Cold War, with lasting consequences for the United States, Vietnam, and global politics. Origins. Vietnam had been a French colony, but after World War II, the communist leader Ho Chi Minh sought independence. The country was divided at the 17th parallel, with a communist North Vietnam supported by the Soviet Union and China, while South Vietnam was backed by the U.S. The U.S. intervened in the early 1960s, fearing the domino theory, the idea that if one country fell to communism, others would follow. By the late 1960s, over 500,000 U.S. troops were in Vietnam. The war was marked by guerrilla warfare, the Tet Offensive, 1968, and massive anti-war protests in the U.S. The U.S. withdrew in 1973 after signing the Paris Peace Accords, but in 1975, North Vietnam captured Saigon, unifying the country under communist rule. The Vietnam War damaged U.S. credibility, leading to greater reluctance to intervene militarily in future conflicts. The Soviet-Afghan War, 1979 to 1989. The USSR's Vietnam. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to support its communist government against a growing Islamic insurgency known as the Mujahideen. The U.S., through Operation Cyclone, provided weapons, training, and funding to the Mujahideen fighters, including Stinger missiles to take down Soviet helicopters. The war dragged on for 10 years, becoming a costly and unpopular conflict for the Soviets. The U.S. saw this as a way to bleed the Soviet Union, similar to how the Vietnam War drained America. In 1989, the USSR withdrew, and Afghanistan fell into chaos, eventually leading to the rise of the Taliban in the 1990s. This war contributed significantly to the decline of the Soviet Union, proving that even a superpower could face military failure. The decline of the Soviet Union and end of the Cold War, 1980s to 1991. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was struggling. Economic stagnation, political unrest, and the arms race had drained its resources. U.S. President Ronald Reagan increased military spending, while Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev attempted reforms. The policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, led to political changes that weakened Soviet control. In 1989, Eastern European communist regimes collapsed, and the Berlin Wall fell, symbolizing the end of Soviet influence in Europe. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, marking the official end of the Cold War. The world had changed forever. Though the Cold War is over, its effects remain. NATO still exists, Russia continues to exert influence, and nuclear weapons remain a global concern. The Cold War shaped the modern world, and its lessons are as relevant today as they were decades ago. This was the Cold War, a conflict that never became a direct war, but changed the course of history. Thank you for watching Historians Lounge. Please like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more history videos.